There is a jar sitting in your kitchen right now. You have seen it 100 times. You have never questioned it. But what if I told you that the story locked inside that ordinary jar is one of the oldest, most dangerous, most desperately human stories ever told? Before refrigerators, before plastic, before supermarkets stacked floor to ceiling with endless choice, there was a problem. A terrifying life and death problem. Every harvest had an expiry date, and when the fruit was gone, it was gone. Winter didn't negotiate. Famine didn't care about your plants. So humanity did what it always does, then backed against a wall. It found a way. The earliest evidence of fruit preservation doesn't come from a royal kitchen. It doesn't come from a famous civilization or a celebrated chef. It comes from caves, from desperate people who noticed something strange happening when fruit was left near fire and mixed with wild honey. The sugar changed things. The heat changed things. The fruit didn't die. And in that moment, in that accidental, beautiful, desperate moment, the idea of jam was born. Not in a cookbook, not in a palace, around a fire, in the dark by someone whose name we will never know. Let's travel, not forward, backward, to a world where sugar was rarer than gold, where sweetness was luxury that could determine social class, political power, and survival itself. Ancient Greece, around 200 BCE, a physician named Dioscorides writes about boiling quince with honey to make a thick, sweet paste. He calls it a medicine, not a food, a medicine. Think about that for a moment. The thing you spread on your morning toast, the thing children beg for, the thing that fills your kitchen with sweetness, was first recorded as a treatment for stomach ailments and digestive problems. The Osorites believed that preserved quince had healing properties, that the combination of fruit acid and honey created something that soothed the body. He wasn't entirely wrong, he just didn't know yet that he was also accidentally documenting one of the greatest culinary discoveries in human history. But Egypt came earlier, much earlier, in the tombs of the pharaohs, those sealed, silent chambers meant to carry rulers into eternity. Archaeologists found something extraordinary. Alongside gold, alongside jewels, alongside elaborate funeral offerings. They found jars of preserved fruit, honey thick, ancient, and still by some accounts faintly edible. Think about what that means. The Egyptians believed that preserved food was sacred enough to carry into the afterlife, that sweetened, preserved fruit belonged in eternity alongside the most precious things they owned. And then there was Rome, because there is always Rome. Roman soldiers, those iron, disciplined, road buildings, empire constructing soldiers, carried preserved fruit on their campaigns, not as a treat, as fuel, as medicine, as a psychological reminder of home. Apicius, the great Roman food writer, describes multiple methods of preserving fruit in honey and grape must. He understood something that wouldn't be scientifically explained for another 2000 years, that high sugar concentration prevents the growth of microorganisms. He didn't have the vocabulary, but he had the result. Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody talks about. Here is the part that got lost between the pages of history. The Arab world didn't just preserve jam, they transformed it. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, Arab scholars and physicians elevated the art of fruit preservation to something approaching science. They refined sugar extraction, They documented hundreds of fruit varieties and their preserving properties. They created murabba, a word that some food historians believe is the direct ancestor of the English word marmalade. And when the Crusaders came to the Middle East, those armored, war worn Europeans arriving in a land that barely understood, they encountered something that had never tasted before sweetness, true sweetness. Not the mild sweetness of European honey, but the concentrated, almost shocking sweetness of refined sugar meeting perfectly preserved fruit. They brought it back, of course, they brought it back. And Europe? Cold, grey, sugar starved Europe was never the same again. But sugar was expensive, catastrophically expensive. In medieval Europe, sugar was stored in locked boxes alongside money. Recipes that called for it were considered luxury documents. A jar of fruit preserve made with proper refined sugar was a status of symbol, a political gift, a declaration of wealth. And then, and this is the moment that changed everything, something happened in the Caribbean. Sugar plantations, slave labor, the brutal colonial sugar trade that would stain human history forever. It also, in its terrible wake, made sugar cheap, available, abundant. For the first time, ordinary people could afford it. And the moment ordinary people could afford sugar, jam stopped being the food of kings. It became the food of everyone. Now we meet some characters because history isn't made by forces, it is made by people. Enter Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner and chef who won in 1810 under the pressure of Napoleon's wars and the need to feed an army on the move. Discovered that food sealed in airtight containers and heated could last almost indefinitely. He called it the art of preserving. He didn't understand why it worked. Pasteur would explain the science decades later. But Appert's method, simple, elegant, revolutionary, is the direct ancestor of every jam jar you have ever sealed. And then there was a Britain, Victorian Britain, to be specific, the empire that turned jam into an industry. The Victorian era invented the jam factory. It invented the standardized jam jar. It invented the concept of jam as a daily staple, something every household should have, from the grand estates of the aristocracy to the cramped terraced houses of factory workers. There is a statistic that will stop you. In 1880, the average British working class family spent more on jam than on vegetables. Jam wasn't a luxury anymore, it was a survival strategy. Cheap calories, a way to make stable bread palatable, a way to give children something sweet in a life that offered very little of it. And across the Atlantic, something was happening that would cement jam's place in global culture forever. The peanut butter and jelly sandwich, a combination so American it practically has a passport, but its story is stranger than you think. Peanut butter was patented in 1884. Sliced bread wasn't invented until 1928. The peanut butter and jam sandwich only became popular during World War II, when both peanut butter and jelly were included in American military rations, and millions of soldiers came home addicted to the combination. Here is something the jam industry doesn't put on the label. Every culture on earth, independently, separately, across thousands of years and thousands of miles, arrived at the same conclusion. Fruit plus sweetener plus heat equals something worth keeping, worth protecting, worth carrying across deserts and oceans and into the future. That isn't a coincidence. That is the human instinct for a survival expressing itself in the most beautiful way possible. Japan developed yokan, a sweetened preserved bean paste that functions like jam in its preservation method and cultural role. India preserved mangoes, tamarinds, and amla in spiced sugar syrup that became the murabbas still sold in markets today. The Ottoman Empire turned rose petals into jam, a preserve so refined it was served at imperial banquets. And in the modern age, jam didn't fade, it evolved. Low sugar jams, organic preserves, artisan, small batch productions selling just for $20 at farmers markets. Jam made from dragon fruit, from lychee, from black garlic and chili. Jam as art, jam as identity, jam as resistance, small producer fighting industrial homogeneity. One handmade jar at a time. And then there is the science, because science finally caught up with what ancient people knew instinctively. The sugar in jam creates what chemists call water activity reduction. It removes the water that bacteria need to survive. The heat kills existing microorganisms. The acid from the fruit creates an environment hostile to decay. Three mechanisms working in perfect harmony, discovered by accident, refined over 10,000 years. So let's go back to that jar in your kitchen, that jar that you have never questioned, that jar that you have reached for on hundreds of mornings without a second thought. In that jar is a technique first discovered by nameless ancestors huddled around fires 10,000 years ago. In that jar is the medicine of ancient Greece, the preserved fruit of Egyptian tombs, the campaigns, rations of Roman legions. In that jar is the knowledge of Arab scholars, the hunger of medieval peasants, the ambition of colonial trade routes. In that jar is Nicholas Appert staying up through the night trying to solve an impossible problem. In that jar is a Victorian child tasting sweetness for the first time on a cold morning. In that jar is a World War II soldier far from home finding comfort in something familiar. In that jar is every mother who ever tried to make something difficult feel a little sweeter, every farmer who ever refused to let a harvest go to waste, every human being who ever looked at something perishable and thought, no, not yet, I'm not done with this. We think of jam as ordinary. We think of it as a background, something that exists between the bread and the butter, noticed only when it is missing. But ordinary things with extraordinary histories are the most important things of all, because they prove that human ingenuity, human desperation, human love, these things don't only produce monuments and empires. Sometimes they produce something small, something amber, something sweet, something you can hold in one hand.